The reason, can you all hear me? The reason that AA succeeds and medical treatment fails is that AA involves the subcortical brain, otherwise known as the heart. And modern psychology does not. There are two principles that AA and its 12 steps use to affect the subcortical brain. First, the emphasis on admitting powerlessness, leading to the positive emotion of love. And second, the recognition that to keep it, you have to give it away, leading to the positive emotion of joy. Both principles are counterintuitive and militate against the entire psychological establishment and the world post-18th century Enlightenment that tries to put the head over the brain. And it's basically hijacked our understanding of the language of the heart. Now, the method I'm going to use is not double-blind control study. I'm going to use follow-up. And many of the things that I say tonight may be against theories that you believe, because when you actually find out what happens, you discover that the world isn't exactly as you thought it was. Implicit in the whole Freudian notion of psychoanalysis is that early communion between mother and child, close attachment, love, is to be grown out of. Now here is the brain. This is where medicine and psychology live. This is where the heart lives. It's called the limbic system. And it was the limbic system that allowed mammals to out-survive the dinosaurs, which only had reptilian brains. And it's how to reach the limbic system that AA becomes important. Here is the leading psychologist while I was going through medical school, who thought emotions were really dumb. And much worse, this is called the positive affect and negative affect scale. And this is what the modern 21st century psychologist has to give to her or his subjects. And basically, these so-called positive emotions are how you tell whether a cat is alive or not. Okay. This is what happens when you're, I'm sorry. This is what happens when you get excited and you drink a lot of beer at a Liverpool soccer match. And this is what happens when you use meditation or when you're cuddled. And real positive emotions affect the parasympathetic side. And I mean, these are all familiar to the big book, only I would translate awe into spirituality or a power greater than ourselves. And this is what happens when you live on the sympathetic side. You get high blood pressure. Oh dear. And you see this in all kinds of illnesses. And this is why the positive emotions emphasized by AA are very good for you. And here is the 11th step prayer, which basically says the same thing that I've said with regard to the positive emotions. And the only place that I would differ with the big book is that it was actually written by a French priest and not by St. Francis. But happiness is really drive reduction, and alcoholics like drive reduction because you reduces guilt and you can punch out drunks. But the Dalai Lama doesn't talk about happiness. He talks about what leads to happiness, and it's basically the 12th step. Okay. So here is the trouble when you don't do follow-up studies. You forget that $40,000 detox programs don't work much better than placebo. But this is only if you do follow-up studies. This is just another way of saying what I just said, that if you take people who've remained abstinent for whatever reason for 2 years, you still have a 40% relapse rate. Now, I'm going to be talking about alcoholism, and by alcoholism, I mean when alcohol damages your occupational or your familial or your physical or your legal health. I'm not talking about quantity and frequency. Winston Churchill died in bed at 93, beloved by his wife, Clemmy. He also won the Nobel Prize. Churchill certainly drank often and heavily. Or worse yet, alcoholism is ignored altogether, as it is by many social scientists. Sir Michael Marmot, a British sociologist, got knighted for his famous British Whitehall studies that said that low occupational rank was bad for your health, and many believe that divorce is bad for your health. They forgot that alcoholism is perfectly terrible for your health. And drunks don't get promoted. And 57% of all of the divorces in the Harvard Grant Study had at least one member of the partnership alcoholic. And even the people who say that divorce is bad for your health note that the reason for death is more frequent among people with cirrhosis. Again, without paying attention to alcoholism, people believe that going to church regularly is good for your health. If, and it's a big if, the study is done in the southern or western United States, heavily inhabited by Adventists, Mormons, and fundamentalists. If you do the same study of frequent attendance at church in either the Harvard study in Boston or in Great Britain, where the dominant religions tend to be Irish Catholicism and Episcopalianism, famous for their heavy drinking, going to church regularly doesn't do a thing for your health. But clearly what I'm talking about is you need to study lives and not computer tapes. For example, computer tapes lead us to believe that cigarettes are the big health danger. Read journals of public health, and the biggie is cigarettes, and alcohol is somewhere down the list. But in the Grant study, alcoholics, when contrasted with social drinkers, were 8 times as likely to be heavy smokers, 5 times as likely to die from lung cancer, and 10 times as likely to die from unnatural deaths. In other words, it's perfectly true that smoking is bad for your health, but it's even truer that the average alcohol-dependent person dies at 67, and the average social drinker dies at 82. The importance of understanding alcoholism not as a bad habit, but as a chronic disease, must be addressed to understand why long-term follow-up is so necessary. Alcoholism, like all chronic diseases, poses problems for science. For example, when is a chronic illness simply a symptom, and when does it become a life-threatening disease? When is a chronic disease merely in remission? And when may it be considered oh dear, I'm sorry. Yes, when is a chronic disease subject in remission, and when is it subject to recurrence? For example, I've had 2 cancers recently, okay? I've been treated by the best available medical methods. They're both in remission. But I'm not going to know for another 4 years whether I'm out of the woods. And the importance of follow-up in alcoholism was brought home to me when I walked out with a senior member of the National Institute of Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse, NIAAA, after he had boasted about the wonderful strides of modern medicine with acamprosate and naltrexone. And I sort of blanked my eyeballs and asked him in my best Little Orphan Annie manner, why did he think there were no follow-ups of acamprosate and naltrexone longer than 2 years? And I said, oh, of course not. They'd be too expensive. And I didn't have the wit at the time to tell him, look, buddy, your sister institute, the National Cancer Institute, would never fund a cancer treatment program with a follow-up of less than 4 years. In other words, science is not achieved by brief double-blind studies, but by follow-up of decades. And my own study of 700 lives, 130 of whom were real alcoholics for 60 years, demonstrates that AA works without any control groups, just the study of lives. Now, I'm not an alcoholic. When I gave my typical pro-AA lecture, and the nice lady that sponsored the lecture took me out to dinner in an expensive fur coat, and when I ordered a old-fashioned, she said, oh shit, I lose my bet. But for 35 years, both as an alcohol researcher and a family member, and as a Class A trustee of Alcoholics Anonymous, I've just been bowled over by how by focusing daily on a power greater than ourselves and upon the positive emotions of the 11th step prayer, people manage to stay abstinent. Now, AA is not, let me just, oh, yeah. This is a little bit complicated, but in 1977, when I first published my results, at that point in my study, there were 21 men with 3 years of abstinence, and there were 22 men who for 3 years had stayed out of trouble with controlled drinking. And Stanton Peele, who's a well-known fan of controlled drinking, said, hey, George, 22 to 21 wins the Super Bowl. And I said, all right, let's wait for 15 years. And waiting for 15 years, the ones with 3 years of abstinence, 18 were still abstinent 15 years later. One turned to controlled drinking, one relapsed, and one decided the study wasn't any fun. The ones with 3 years of controlled drinking, 3 resorted to abstinence. Of the 8 who continued to drink in controlled fashion, 3 on re-examination probably didn't meet criteria for alcoholism, 7 relapsed, and 4 decided that this wasn't a fun study. God bless you. Oh dear, I don't have a, here we go. Well, it's all right. this just looks at the difference between the people who achieved stable abstinence. 58, this is from both the Harvard study and study of inner city men. And the 86 men who kept on drinking until they died at the end of the 60-year follow-up. And it helped to be poor and not a Harvard man. It made a big difference to have been to 30 or more meetings of AA. And surprisingly, recovery was more frequent among the alcohol dependent. And what this means is the more hopeless the patient, the more likely they are to pull up their socks and get sober. It's the same way with hip replacements. The more disabled you are with a hip, the more likely you are to put up with the rubbish of surgery. Nuisance, I shouldn't say, not. The Irish, who are far more likely to become alcoholic than the men of Mediterranean ethnicity, because in Italy, anybody can buy alcohol at 10, but it's not cool to get drunk at soccer matches. And in Ireland, you break your mother's heart if you touch alcohol before you're 21, and you break your father's heart if you haven't been dead drunk by the time you're 21. But this meant the Irish were more likely to become dependent, and their prognosis, once alcoholic, was actually better than the Mediterranean, who tended to drink in greater moderation. Now, this is why AA isn't hoke or cult or faith healing, but it's that AA directly affects the central nervous system. The importance of the limbic system to addiction has only been appreciated since the 21st century with the advent of brain imaging and the fact that morphine and cocaine just love to goose the nucleus accumbens. But Bill W., half a century before brain imaging, found that you could reach the nucleus accumbens and the tegmentum through the language of the heart. And you can do this with love, gratitude, and joy, as well as with cocaine and morphine. Now this is, well, as far as I'm concerned, for Bill W., it was sheer rocket science, but let me begin with what I think is the first limbic component of AA. And notice that I'm talking here not about the exact language of the 12 steps. In that, I'm being a little heretical. I'm talking about the language of the heart. The first step is to allow the alcoholic to receive unconditional love. One reason for the failure of professional therapy to alter the natural history of alcoholism is that the hold that drug addiction has on the human beings doesn't rest up here in the cortex where we do mathematics and say the 12 steps. But the hold that addiction has is on the reptile brain, and alcoholics, like alligators, notoriously do not come when they're cold, but they do come when they're thirsty. So when we stand up and say, we are powerless over alcohol, our lives have become unmanageable, we've come to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity, and we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. In order to turn oneself over to God, or a home group, or to a trusted other, AA has always been very clear that the definition of God was the alcoholic's own choosing, as long as it wasn't me. Is to allow oneself to feel loved. The first 3 steps involve feeling love. But what does that mean? It means giving up control. Why do you think that millennials are so frightened of love and commitment? Why is love sometimes called a 4-letter word? Because it's scary, because it means making yourself vulnerable. And that means, just like your first visit to Match.com, your first visit to AA may not be enough to make you give up your vulnerability and accept the fact that you're loved. And so it may take months or years. Physiologically, during the leap of faith required by the first 3 steps, the parasympathetic nervous system, which I showed you, allowing yourself to be cuddled, and oxytocin, the cuddle hormone, replace the sympathetic nervous system's overstimulation. Alcohol is advertised as a sedative drug, but just tell that to fans in an English soccer stadium. Real positive emotion reduces our basic metabolism, muscle tension, blood pressure. And over time, putting yourself in the loving embrace of a welcoming AA home group has much the same effect. AA also asks that we replace our resentments, that's the sympathetic nervous system, with an attitude of gratitude, another positive emotion. And we should fake it till we make it. Now, as a card-carrying psychoanalyst, I'm horrified by such a hallmark slogan. However, long-term follow-up suggests that it's not AA slogans that need therapy. In my own 70-year longitudinal study of alcoholics, 2,500 hours of psychotherapy to about 50 different grant study men, produced one stable remission. It's very different from sticking with the AA. Unfortunately, the disease of alcoholism makes it difficult for anyone but a fellow suffering, but now sober, in AA alcoholic, to love them. For the arrogant, resentful, narcissistic, bad-smelling drunk to step into a room where everyone has smelled like him, been as arrogant as him, and even more resentful, is pure magic. Suddenly you're loved, not because your priest or the Salvation Army lass feels sorry for you, but because the group needs you and feels empathy for you. Two of the basic components of unconditional love. Gratitude is acknowledgement of the goodness in one's life, of recognizing the source of this goodness lies at least partially outside of the self. A criticism of AA is that turning resentments into gratitude is in part conforming to group pressure. But for many of us, so is dieting and keeping fit. Cognitive insights, on the other hand, usually stay in the cortex, and the person feels nothing. The second component of AA is joy, and the last two steps of AA facilitate the experience of joy. Positive emotions like joy, were not discussed academically until the 21st century, but they appeared in St. Paul's Fruits of the Spirit in his letter to the Galatians about 2,000 years ago, and 75 years ago, they were emphasized in AA's 11th step prayer. And the 12th step of AA, of course, as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to alcoholics and practice principles, otherwise positive emotions and spirituality, in all our affairs, is again how to be happy. I don't need to tell you this, but it is important to realize that joy and love and addiction share similar terminal pathways. Dopaminergic brain tracts can be shown to underlie addictive behavior in mammals and reptiles. Alcohol stimulates dopamine release in the previously mentioned nucleus accumbens. Alcohol also decreases amygdala excitation and thus decreases limbic fear, and better yet, cortical guilt about drive reduction, smoking, unsafe sex, and punching out jerks. Experimental evidence suggests that mother-child attachment, unconditional love, is also associated with reduction in amygdala firing and increases nucleus accumbens activity. But unlike addiction and selfish happiness, joy is all about connection to the others. Moms and babies feel joy playing peekaboo. Joy is what we feel, and this has been shown, when we give to the charity of our choice, it stimulates the nucleus accumbens. And what recovering alcoholics feel when they share their strength, hope, and experience with a still suffering alcoholic. Now, language of the heart is still a novelty to most academics. In 1940, when the Big Book came out advocating the language of the heart, had already been published for a year, the word empathy was still not in the 24-volume Oxford English Dictionary. Nor did joy appear in any of Freud's 24 brilliant volumes about emotions. Now, I've already said that love makes us feel vulnerable, and joy makes psychologists worry that the axe is going to fall. It's totally nonsensical, but we don't like feeling vulnerable. And this is the marvel, of course, of a home group. Connection, reunion, communion, joy. Joy is how selfish genes unselfishly share. It's win-win. Freud and Marx, that's, what they wanted was a loving community, but they dumped on religion. And alcohol is the lonely human's autistic connection, and it's the lonely human's religion. Critics, even reluctant fans of AA, scornfully dismiss it as a self-help group. AA is about as much a self-help group as a community barn raising. C.S. Lewis points out that addictive pleasure and joy are very different from each other. They've got but one thing in common. Once you've experienced it, you want to experience it again. Joy and pleasure differ because joy, like love, is never within one's own power to induce, while addictive pleasure always is. We can only be tickled in relationship. We can get drunk anytime we choose. What differentiates AA from universities, religion, and of course, cults, is that AA doesn't collect money, unlike the University of Michigan. The fact that being hugged with joy, love, and altruism soothes is scientifically true. In contrast, the pursuit of money, like the pursuit of booze, has been proved, at least by folk wisdom, to be the root of all evil. Okay, so how do I prove that AA is not the cult that many thoughtful academics believe it to be? By long-term follow-up. After 20 years, Scientology was put on the cover of Time with the title The Cult of Greed. After 20 years, the Alcoholics Anonymous received the Lasker Award, America's only Nobel Prize for medicine. But Bill Wilson, to maintain the tradition of anonymity, refused to be put on the cover of Time. It still must have been hard for him. Now, I want to acknowledge that the effectiveness of AA depends not just on mysterious limbic connections, but also on rational cognitive techniques. In his review of the literature on remission from addiction to alcohol, tobacco, food, and opiates, Alan Marmot identified 4 behavioral techniques in yellow there that can lead to stable remission independent of AA. First, in their search for drive reduction, addicts of all stripes prevent relapse to alcohol by finding a substitute dependence. Thumbsuckers learn to chew the erasers off of pencils. Some relatively dangerous substitute addictions are benzodiazepines, 3-pack-a-day cigarette smoking, and gambling. Some more benign ways of stimulating the nucleus accumbens are meditation, trout fishing, and helping others to stay sober. Second, many addicts achieve relapse prevention by compulsory supervision. That means the presence of events independent of willpower that systematically keep in mind the consequences of substance abuse. AA and most personal trainers provide external supervision. They don't trust free will. They don't trust willpower. AA suggests that new members return again and again. New members are encouraged to find a sponsor to telephone and visit often. The sponsor, in turn, encourages new members to work the steps, attend frequent meetings, and engage in service to other alcoholics. Each of these activities provide a daily involuntary reminder that alcohol is enemy and not friend. However, AA also understands that supervision works best when it's freely chosen. We willingly suffer under the strict discipline of our athletic coaches, but we sometimes evade traffic regulations and chafe under parental supervision. AA understands that the intense desire to drink will return for many and that ongoing support is crucial. But AA understands that sponsors need to be chosen by the individual and not assigned by the group. For physicians, this supervision is very often compulsory drug testing on a regular basis, or you lose the right to make $400,000 a year. And also frequent attendance in AA meetings. which helps keep the memory green. A third common method of relapse prevention is to get involved in an inspirational, spiritual group that facilitates identification with sober individuals. Remember that AA groups have the highest percentage of teetotalers of any group in the world, except perhaps some mosques. As AA says, identify, don't compare. Finally, new love relationships are important to recover. It's important for ex-addicts to bond with people who they've not hurt in the past and to whom they're not deeply emotionally in debt. It helps them to bond with people to whom they can offer compassionate help, often people needier than themselves. Thus, alcoholics often overcome relapse by forming close, if sometimes codependent, relationships with non-family, but compatible former barflies, most easily found in AA meetings. In conclusion, more than half a century ago, AA focused on the positive emotions unrecognized by academic psychology. These positive emotions, joy, awe, hope, love, trust, forgiveness, compassion, and especially gratitude, are fostered in every AA group meeting. So, what's the conclusion? Without double-blind studies, how do I lovingly suggest that join AA or die? Well, it's not so funny because it happens, but this is the Harvard cohort, and this is the inner city. They were matched with delinquents and had all the risk factors of the inner city, minority groups, low IQ, etc. But they weren't delinquent. And as you can see, the poor became abstinent more often than the rich. Now, this is important because Project Match and newbies at Dawn Farm are disappointed if after 10 AA meetings you don't get it and keep on drinking. If you look at the people that became abstinent, they had 2 decades of active alcoholism. And yet, definition of abstinence is a mean of 19 years. So we're not talking 2 or even 5-year follow-ups. The people who recovered had slightly higher problem drinking scores. But this in the table looks complicated, but translated into plain English, it means that the people who recovered went to 30 times more AA meetings in their lives than the people who relapsed. You don't need a test of statistical significance. It's mind-boggling. And the problem with critics of this data is they wondered if perhaps going to AA often was a function of compliance to treatment. So two Stanford researchers, Keith Humphreys and Rudy Moose, carried out an 8-year follow-up study that contrasted AA attendance with compliance with professional treatment. By 8 years, the two goals of less drinking and more abstinence was only weakly correlated with how much professional treatment you got. But it was robustly related to the frequency of AA attendance without professional treatment. Thomas Insel, director of the National Institute of Mental Health, suggests that it's possible that the neural mechanisms we associate with drug abuse and addiction might have evolved for social recognition, reward, and euphoria, critical elements in the process of attachment, and of course, in the evolution of our ancestors. AA succeeds because it returns the limbic brain, hijacked by alcohol, to the purposes for which it was designed. Thank you. Yes. Yes.
My question is, in this particular slide, the first white score, I'm trying to understand it. Like if you were a high intelligence, which would put you in the college cohort,
Yep.
and you were abstinent, you had 9 people that were abstinent,
Yep.
and their age of being first alcoholic is is that their first drink or their first?
No, losing control.
Okay, so when they lost control, what does the 34 plus or minus 9 mean?
Well, don't worry about the plus or minus 9. That's just.
Okay, skip that, but.
It means that people that get eventually sober lost control earlier, which meant they were more dependent usually. The point is that the worse the alcoholic, the better chance he or she has of sitting on those hard church benches and drinking all that awful coffee.
So, I understand that, but what does the 34 signify? Is it a number of people or is
Oh,
it
I'm
age or-
sorry. No, it's age. It's 34 years.
So they've been abstinent for 30 or 40 years?
No. They lost control at 34.
Okay.
They remained absent for 20. This is a very complicated slide, and you're not alone in having trouble with it. And this is the score of how many different ways you had problem drinking. And then this is the number of AA meetings you went to on average. And clearly, some people went to none, and some people went to 1,000.
And when you quoted that, the one group who went to so many more AA meetings than the other recovered better? More
No, never.
quickly or whatever?
No, if you went to an average of 5 AA meetings, you never recovered, all right? You kept on drinking till you died for 60 years. If you went to an average of 140 AA meetings, you recovered and were abstinent for at least 19 years.
Excuse me, are you saying over what period of time?
60,
An average of 5 meetings over? what-
a lifetime.
And opposed to an average of 140 meetings or whatever?
Yeah.
Over a lifetime?
Oh, they're both low.
Good. Yes.
My question has nothing to do with this. The difference between the consistent rate, or was that a one-time study?
If you attend English Milan soccer games, it's pretty obvious. The drunks are all English, and the Italians have been drinking since they were 10 years old. But if an Irishman comes home drunk, his father says, "Good on you." And if an Italian comes home drunk, his father throws him downstairs. So I mean, it's a cultural, and it's not 100%, but it's.
Is it cultural alone only, or is there any impact because of the amygdala?
Ha 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 ha! I don't know.
Well, because the amygdala, plays a big part in our emotions.
I don't know if Italians and Irish have different size amygdala. I'll pass on that.
It's like Canadians.
Yes. That's very funny. Did you all hear that? It's like Canadians. They have small amygdalas. Good on them.
So when you started, you commended On Farm. What do you find that's unique about that treatment program that you praise?
Because you haven't given up the idea that the task of any treatment program is to gently lead the alcoholic into a community AA group, so that where I learned all I know about alcohol was in a program where I had to, as a condition of employment, go to an AA meeting a month, which meant I accumulated 100 AA meetings, and I took the cotton out of my ears and I put it in my mouth. And our job, as working on the inpatient unit, was to sort of put out little seeds of corn so the people we treated would follow the corn to their neighborhood young people's AA group.
That answers
Oh.
all 20 questions.
Yeah.
How are your colleagues in the psychology community and in the psychiatry community responding to your use of the heart? And thank God that you're in a place in your career where you can just do that. But what's the response you're getting about this?
The people who are going to go to heaven when they die all understand, and the vast majority don't know what the hell I'm talking about. I'll need to put up another slide like this to get some more questions. Well, thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry.
Does your research indicate that alcoholics ever get over the need for community?
We none of us do, honey.
Well, I don't mean isolation. I'm talking about, do they always have to go to meetings?
Well, that's different. I mean, there are no good figures, but if at places like the 80th anniversary, I mean, you sort of get informal AA statistics, there's many alcoholics who stop going to meetings after 5 years. I mean, they collect their 5 or their 10-year chip, and then they don't go to meetings, but they still stay sober. But if you've got to make it for 5 years. So that, I mean, and this is the same with the treatment of doctors, which is much better researched, that doctors have to undergo compulsory urine testing for 5 years, and then things usually work out. So it's, I mean, that's a rough figure. Same with cancer. If I make it for 5 years, my cancer hopefully will be cured, but it's a ballpark figure. And it isn't, you don't have to go on peeing in a bottle if you're a doctor forever. And you don't have to go to AA meetings if you don't want to. But I've never been to an AA meeting I didn't like, so I can strongly recommend them.
Regarding that informal study that you mentioned, would you say that people that have, out of the people that are 30 years sober, let's say, would it be true that the majority of them still do AA meetings?
The answer is I don't know. It's a perfectly good question.
I do.
Yeah, you might have mentioned this, Pat.
Yes, right.
What?
I was just wondering, does bigger amygdala mean that you're going to be more prone to becoming an alcoholic?
No, that's a red herring. We shouldn't pay attention to that, except it's funny when it comes to Canadians. No, I mean, don't, I mean, it's important to know that you have an amygdala, you have a nucleus accumbens, and you have a heart. And emotions are important. Yes?
So given the role that these emotions play on reinforcing the limbic system in the AA community especially, are you aware of any research that supports or contradicts, like, say, co-occurring diagnoses like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder that has a positive impact on those?
The short answer is very few people become alcoholic because they're depressed. A great many people become depressed because they're alcoholic. And if you can get drunks sober, their depression score looks normal. So the short answer is, and I mean, I've got a whole slide that I don't have to put up, but it goes through about 8 different reasons why, if someone is alcoholic and depressed, or if someone is a heavy smoker and alcoholic, the way to stop the smoking is cure the drinking. The way to cure the depression is to cure the alcoholism. Yes?
Historically, AA was not very enthusiastic about people being in psychotherapy. And I think those attitudes have changed. But what's your position on a combination of AA with some type of psychotherapy?
What makes AA different from all the other cults is that AA says very clearly, no AA member should play doctor. And if someone needs medicine for any reason, physical or emotional, they should be allowed to take it. So basically, it's none of AA's business, except, as I say, you can go to 2,500 psychotherapy sessions and not get sober, and you can go to 100 or so AA meetings over 5 years, and you do pretty well. You had your hand up.
I had a question, actually just asking if you could give us a 2-minute blurb on your book, Spiritual Evolution. I know it's a little off the subject, but not really.
60 million years ago, an asteroid hit the Earth. All of the dinosaurs died. They didn't have limbic systems. Little fuzzy mammals that had to live underground grew up, and over 200 million years learned how to walk on their 2 legs and found AA. Yes.
I was wondering, you mentioned that they had looked at compliance.
I'm sorry, I didn't start again.
You looked at compliance and other kinds of treatment programs, and I think you said that they were not, that none of them were effective on follow-up.
They were, it didn't,
You're right.
they made a small contribution. Remember, out of those 2,500 hours of psychotherapy, there was one remission. It's just that recovery correlated with regular AA meetings rather than.
What about the more comprehensive kinds of treatment programs? You know, there's a lot of money going into treatment programs.
Tell me about it. And who listens to me and who listens to Dawn Farm? But
Based, you know, based on what you're saying, we should discontinue all those other treatment programs and just send people to AA. Is that sort of what you're saying?
no, not AA. You send them to Dawn Farm, or you send them the way Hazelden and Betty Ford used to be in the old days before they got interested in making money.
Yeah.
I'll burn in hell for saying that. But. so that there's nothing wrong with comprehensive treatment programs. It's just that to work, comprehensive treatment programs need to believe in their hearts that alcoholic AA works. And as the program that I worked at, which was a straight detox, we weren't trying to cure people, but all the staff had to go to AA meetings. And that's what comprehensive treatment programs to get you may not understand because you don't come to an AA meeting from outside, but I was a psychiatrist. I knew who was on the upstairs floor, which were the psychiatric patients, and every now and then I'd see one of the psychiatric patients who was considered hopeless on the floor upstairs at an AA meeting, looking happy and sober and on their way to recovery. So that was very good for me to see the magic of, where else in the world could you have that much misery in your life and have every meeting filled with laughter? And if in contrast you go to my psychoanalytic society meetings, they're a bunch of old grumps and nobody laughs. I think we may be done.